The effective employment of Lend-Lease equipment was compromised by the persistent objection of the Soviet side to allowing Western personnel access to help with training and repair, or to supply information on how the aid was being utilized. By 1943, large stockpiles of material had accumulated in the Soviet Union, but it was impossible to check why this was or to limit further deliveries without Soviet cooperation. Soviet secretiveness made it difficult at the time to counteract the regular criticism of combat failures, while, despite promises, Soviet officials released little information on the development of Soviet tanks and aircraft, apart from the one T-34 tank sent to the United States in 1942. We still meet their requests to the limit of our ability, complained the head of the American military mission in Moscow, John Dean, to General Marshall, and they meet ours to the minimum that will keep us sweet. Growing suspicion that Soviet requests for Lend Lease supplies, which reached a peak in 1944-45, included goods intended for Soviet post war reconstruction, led to political pressure in Washington to place limits on Soviet assistance. In August 1945, following the Japanese surrender, President Truman announced the immediate end of all Lend Lease shipments without consulting either of the main recipients. Tensions in the Lend Lease relationship were inevitable given the nature of the geographical scope involved and the contending requirements for urgent supply, but in the end, vast resources, chiefly from the American productive surplus, were shared between the Allies. Was this record, in the words of Edward Stettinius, the Lend Lease administrator, a weapon for victory? The answer is more complicated than it seems. For years after the war, the official Soviet line was to downplay or to ignore altogether the role of Lend Lease in the Soviet war effort. This was a deliberate act of historical distortion. Shortly after the end of the war, informal guidelines were issued, which no sensible author could ignore under Stalin, that Lend Lease did not play a somewhat noticeable part in Russian victory. The official line until the 1980s was to insist that Lend Lease goods came late, were often of poor quality, and comprised only 4% of the weapons produced by the Soviet Union's own efforts. During the war, however, Soviet leaders privately admitted how important all the forms of aid were. In the taped interviews for his memoirs, Khrushchev revealed the importance Stalin attached to the aid, but the following passage was only published in the 1990s. Several times I heard Stalin acknowledge Lend Lease in the small circle of people around him. He said that if we had had to deal with Germany one to one, we would not have been able to cope. Marshal Zhukov, Victor in Berlin, toed the party line in his memoirs published in 1969, but in a bugged conversation 6 years earlier, he was overheard to say that without foreign aid, the Soviet Union could not have continued the war.